They were pushed to the edge, some beaten, others stalked, assaulted, humiliated. But when the justice system failed them, they made a choice that turned them into headline-making killers. From quiet victims to convicted murderers, these black women claimed their power in the most chilling way possible: through blood. In this gripping dive into the most deadly black women who took revenge, we uncover the twisted love triangles, brutal abuse, and deadly betrayals that led to shocking acts of violence. Nicole Grant. It started like any ordinary Miami morning, humid, buzzing, and half awake. But at 7:30 a.m. outside the Clarion Hotel, something far more explosive than Florida heat was about to unfold. Nicole Grant, 43 years old, wasn't just heartbroken. She was done. She had just discovered her fiancé sneaking out of a hotel with another woman, smiling, carefree, hand in hand. To some, this might be a moment of silent heartbreak or maybe a bitter confrontation. But Nicole, she didn't hesitate. She hit the gas. Hotel surveillance footage later captured it all. A car speeding up from behind as the couple walked through the parking lot. No warning, just sudden chaos. The car pulled up beside the unsuspecting woman. In a flash, the driver reached out, grabbing her by the ponytail, and dragged her along the pavement. Then came the pepper spray. Brutal, fast, targeted. The woman was left battered and stunned. And Nicole? She drove off, but she didn't get far. Police were quick to act. With help from the hotel's security footage and the vehicle's license plate, officers tracked Nicole down later that same day. Inside her car, a pink pepper spray canister tucked inside a black handbag. When confronted, Nicole didn't deny it. In fact, she confessed right then and there. She said she was tired of her fiancé's constant cheating, and in that moment, her anger snapped into action. She was arrested and charged with aggravated battery using a deadly weapon, her own car. 2 days later, she posted bail. Her arraignment was scheduled, and a judge ordered her to have no contact with the victim. But the footage remains undeniable, unforgettable. Phyllis. Let's rewind to a different kind of battlefield, Massachusetts, 1755. The scene isn't a modern hotel parking lot like Nicole Grant's story, but a quiet colonial kitchen where something deadly was brewing, one spoonful at a time. Phyllis was enslaved. She wasn't free to speak her mind or live her life the way she wanted. But what she could do, she did in silence, with precision, patience, and a plan. On the morning of June 29th, she cooked up a warm bowl of oatmeal for Captain John Codman, the man who claimed ownership over her life. To him, it was just another breakfast. But for Phyllis, it was revenge served hot. 2 days later, Codman was dead. For years, Phyllis, along with 2 others, Phoebe and Mark, had been slowly slipping poison into his food. Not just once or twice, but over the course of 2 whole years. Arsenic, rat poison, potter's lead, anything she could get her hands on. It was careful, it was calculated, and it was fatal. Why? Because when you're enslaved, brutalized, and denied justice, sometimes revenge is the only form of control left. Phoebe somehow avoided conviction. No one's quite sure how. Mark was found guilty and hanged. But Phyllis, she was sentenced to something far more terrifying, burned alive at the stake. She didn't just commit murder, she sparked fear, not just in her own town, but across the colonies, because her crime spoke loudly in a world where enslaved women were never meant to have power. And here's the thing, Phyllis wasn't alone. Between 1681 and 1865, dozens of enslaved black women were executed for killing or trying to kill the very people who held them in bondage. Some used poison, others fire, some used sheer strength. But all of them, in one way or another, said, "Enough." Virginia Christian. It was March 1912 in Hampton, Virginia. quiet on the outside but boiling over beneath the surface. And at the center of it all stood Virginia Christian, just 16 years old, overworked, underpaid, and trapped in a world that gave her nothing, not even a chance. Virginia had dropped out of school to help her family. Her mother was paralyzed, her father barely scraping by as a fisherman. So Virginia went to work for Ida Balote, a white woman known for being abusive and mean-spirited. Her father warned her. So did her aunt. But when your stomach is empty, warnings get pushed aside. That morning, Virginia walked into Balote's house to clear up a petty accusation that she'd stolen a skirt. What started as a conversation quickly exploded. Balote accused her of stealing more, a gold locket this time. She yelled, she attacked, she hit Virginia with a spittoon. And Virginia, she fought back. She grabbed a broomstick and struck Balote. Then, in a panic, she shoved a towel down her throat, maybe to stop her from screaming, maybe just out of raw fear and survival instinct. The violence was chaotic, ugly, real, and it ended with Balote dead. But here's what makes this case feel especially haunting. Virginia didn't run far. She went home and did her chores. She didn't deny what she did. She even confessed when the police came. She said it was self-defense. She didn't mean to kill anyone. She was scared, cornered, and completely alone. The justice system didn't care. She was tried by an all-white, all-male jury. Her lawyers, 2 black men, argued passionately that this was a crime of the moment, not a cold-blooded plan. They begged the court to recognize her age, her fear, her circumstances, but it only took the jury 23 minutes to decide her fate: death. Virginia Christian was electrocuted the day after her 17th birthday. She became the only underage girl executed in the U.S. in the entire 20th century. No reformatory, no second chance. And if you're wondering why she didn't get sent to a youth facility, well, Virginia didn't even have one for black girls. In fact, her death sparked the creation of the first such reformatory 3 years later, but for her, it came too late. Before her death, Virginia wrote a letter. She said she hoped to meet her employer in heaven. She said she blamed no one. Whitney Caraway. Unlike the women we've met so far, survivors pushed to their breaking point, this next case unfolds from a very different angle. A deadly confrontation, a hidden weapon, and a rivalry that ended in bloodshed. This is the story of Whitney Caraway and the woman whose life she took, Amanda Newton. It was a little after 1:30 a.m. on a quiet May night in 2023 when police in San Antonio responded to multiple 911 calls about a violent disturbance at an apartment complex on LeVay's Drive. What they found was chilling. Amanda Newton, just 35 years old, was lying in the parking lot, bleeding from 11 stab wounds. EMS rushed to save her, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The motive? A love triangle. At the center of the tragedy was a man, romantically involved with both Newton and Whitney Caraway, who was 36 at the time. According to court documents, the 2 women had agreed to confront each other that night. It was supposed to be a fight, maybe even a heated argument. But what happened instead was premeditated violence. Caraway brought a concealed knife to the meeting, and when tempers flared, she used it, stabbing Newton repeatedly in a brutal and fatal attack. Surveillance footage later confirmed what witnesses had told investigators. Caraway took things too far, way too far. The prosecution argued that jealousy fueled the attack, but it was the cold finality of Amanda Newton's death that weighed most heavily on the jury. In May 2025, after a 2-year wait for justice, Whitney Caraway was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison for murder. The DA's office didn't mince words. When people turn to violence and take a life, they must be held accountable, said Bexar County District Attorney Joe Gonzalez. This wasn't about self-defense. It wasn't a response to abuse. It was rage disguised as confrontation and a calculated decision to end a rival's life. Amanda Newton never got to walk away from that parking lot. She never got to tell her side of the story. Crystal Kaiser. At just 17 years old, Crystal Kaiser made a decision that would set off a years-long legal storm and ignite national debate about how the justice system treats victims who fight back. In June 2018, Kaiser fatally shot Randall Voller, a 34-year-old Kenosha man who had essayed her, trafficked her, and recorded the assaults for over a year. What followed wasn't a rescue, a rehabilitation, or even recognition of her victimhood. Instead, Crystal was charged with homicide, and prosecutors pushed for life in prison. Crystal met Voller when she was 16. He lured her with gifts, cash, and kindness, then coerced her into getting intimate with him and later sold her to other men. For over a year, she was trapped in a cycle of exploitation. Her case wasn't unique, but what made it especially disturbing was that law enforcement already knew who Randall Voller was. 4 months before he was killed, Voller had been arrested for the essay of multiple underage girls, but shockingly, he was released the same day. And then he went right back to abusing Crystal and others. In June 2018, Crystal traveled to Voller's house in Kenosha, armed with a gun. She shot him twice in the head, set the house on fire, and drove away in his car. Prosecutors framed it as premeditated murder. They accused her of committing the killing to steal his vehicle. But Crystal claimed it was self-defense, a desperate act by a teenager who had been essayed, trafficked, and silenced. Her attorneys argued that her actions stemmed from the abuse she endured, a pattern authorities had proof of, including video recordings of Voller abusing numerous underage girls, Crystal among them. Crystal's legal battle raised a groundbreaking question: can a victim of trafficking use that trauma as a legal defense for homicide? In a landmark decision, the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled in 2022 that she could present an affirmative defense. This meant she could introduce evidence of her abuse and trafficking as justification for her actions. This ruling didn't just affect Crystal. It sent a signal across the nation about how courts might approach the criminalization of trafficking survivors moving forward. Despite the court victory, Crystal faced an impossible choice: go to trial and risk a life sentence, or take a plea deal and serve time, but with the hope of freedom on the horizon. In early 2024, Crystal accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 11 years in prison for reckless homicide. She had already served more than a year and a half in jail at that point, and will be on 5 years of supervised release once her sentence ends. In an interview from jail, she said, "I get to try to move on." Crystal Kaiser's case became a lightning rod in the fight for survivor justice. Activists from the Me Too movement, anti-trafficking advocates, and legal reform groups rallied around her. Her story exposed a legal blind spot, how the system often punishes survivors who defend themselves. Lakeisha Wilson Bay. In the early hours of January 17, 2000, what began as an act of retaliation turned into a brutal killing that destroyed multiple lives. Lakeisha Wilson Bay, then only 22 years old, was convicted of leading a violent mob of young women into the Southeast D.C. apartment of Tamika Blackwell, a former friend, and stabbing her to death. More than 2 decades later, the story of this killing still stings for the families involved, because everyone lost something that day. In November 2000, Wilson Bay was convicted of first-degree murder while armed, assault with intent to kill, aggravated assault, and other violent charges. At sentencing, D.C. Superior Court Judge Russell F. Kanan made it clear this wasn't an accident or a heat-of-the-moment fight. It was a premeditated murder, and he had no intention of showing mercy. And with that, Wilson Bay was sentenced to 36 years to life in prison. As the sentence fell, Wilson Bay's mother collapsed in tears. Her uncle clutched a Bible, and family members whispered, "Oh my God." But there were no celebrations in the courtroom that day. Even Blackwell's grandmother, Helen Smith, reached out to comfort Wilson Bay's grieving family, telling them, "None of us had anything to do with this. It was just everybody acting crazy." Lakeisha Wilson Bay claimed she didn't stab Tamika. She described the killing as an unfortunate incident and accused her former friends of lying to avoid harsher sentences. But the jury didn't believe her. Judge Kanan reminded the court that Blackwell and Wilson Bay had been close once. The entire group of women involved had been friends. But something had fractured in that relationship. Jealousy, anger, loyalty, revenge. And in the end, 2 lives were lost. Both Wilson Bay and Blackwell left behind young children, now being raised by their grandmothers. 2 little lives altered forever because of a decision made in rage. This wasn't just a murder. It was a tale of what happens when retaliation replaces reason, when friendship is traded for vengeance, and when pride becomes a death sentence. Wanda Jean Allen. In 1988, Wanda Jean Allen fatally shot her partner, Gloria Leathers, outside an Oklahoma City police station. The 2 women had met years earlier while both were incarcerated and had since entered into a tumultuous and violent relationship. The day of the murder was no different. Their argument began at a local grocery store, escalated at their home, and climaxed outside the police station. Allen later claimed she had been struck by Leathers with a hand rake during the fight at their house. When Leathers allegedly came at her again outside the station, Allen pulled a gun and shot her. The wound on Allen's face from the rake was still clearly visible when her mugshot was taken. Prosecutors, however, painted the shooting as premeditated. They pointed to the fact that Allen had a prior conviction for manslaughter for shooting and killing a roommate in 1981 during another argument. In both cases, Allen claimed she acted in self-defense. The jury didn't buy it. In 1989, Wanda Jean Allen was sentenced to death for the murder of Gloria Leathers. But that sentence didn't come without deep controversy. Years after her conviction, in 1995, a clinical psychologist conducted a comprehensive psychological evaluation of Allen and found clear and convincing evidence of cognitive and sensory motor deficits and brain dysfunction. That brain damage was believed to be linked to an adolescent head injury, sustained when Wanda Jean was hit by a truck as a teenager. This trauma, the psychologist argued, could have profoundly affected her judgment, impulse control, and comprehension, crucial factors that were never introduced during her trial or sentencing. Even more disturbing, at the time of her trial, Wanda Jean Allen had an IQ of 69, placing her within the borderline intellectual functioning range. Despite this, no mitigation expert was called to testify in her defense, and the jury never heard any of the evidence related to her brain damage or cognitive impairments. Despite widespread appeals from human rights advocates, legal experts, and even international bodies urging a stay of execution due to her mental capacity and lack of adequate defense, Wanda Jean Allen was executed at the age of 41. She was only the second woman executed in Oklahoma's history, and the first in the U.S. in the modern era who was black. To the state, it was the enforcement of law and accountability. To her advocates, it was an execution of a woman failed by every system that should have protected her, from childhood poverty and abuse to a legal system that overlooked her trauma and brain injury. Tiffany Janae Carroll. Tiffany Janae Carroll's story is yet another haunting entry in the long list of women who remain imprisoned for fighting back against their abusers. In 2020, Carol was sentenced to 15 years after pleading guilty but mentally ill to voluntary manslaughter for fatally stabbing her abusive partner, William Jamal Johnson, during a heated argument at a home in Greenwood, South Carolina. The court acknowledged that Carol had been a victim of domestic violence throughout their relationship, and despite this, she was still handed a lengthy sentence. In May 2025, after serving 6 years, Carol's second attempt at parole was denied by the South Carolina Parole Board. Though 3 members supported her release, the required 2/3 majority was not reached. 1 member abstained and another was absent, effectively sealing her continued incarceration. The denial sparked outrage from advocates who had worked tirelessly to secure her freedom, even going so far as to seek a pardon through a state lawmaker. But the Department of Probation, Parole, and Pardon Services ruled her ineligible, citing her current parole consideration. For many watching her case, the justice system once again failed to recognize the full context of her actions, that they were not driven by malice, but survival. These cases are raw, real, and unforgettable. Each woman's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about abuse, justice, and the thin line between victim and perpetrator. Were these acts of vengeance or desperate bids for survival in a world that ignored their pain? As the system continues to fail so many, we're left asking, how many more women have to kill just to be believed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.